While James had been jailed for cutting a hole in the convertible top of some lady's car, James even purchased a new top to replace the one he had damaged, but he was still sent to jail. As for the prison itself, Attica had opened in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and since that time up until the 1970s, there had been no real attempts to improve or modernize the structure. The prison consisted of 5 main housing blocks labeled A, B, C, D, and E. Each of these blocks held 500 prisoners and had its own exercise yard. These blocks contained 2 basic types of cells. Some had doors with bars, which were thick with rust and flaking paint. These cells offered little in the way of privacy, in contrast to the cells that had solid steel doors with a small viewing slot, which made them much more claustrophobic. Regardless, the cells tended to be, depending upon the time of year, either drafty and lacking in heat or so hot they were suffocating. Meanwhile, each cell was equipped with a bed, a toilet, and a sink, which hardly left any room for the inmate held inside to move around, which made the fact that they were only allowed 31 to 100 minutes in the yard to actually move around that much worse. As a result, many of the inmates were left restless, bored, and increasingly on edge, as they were locked in their cells anywhere from 15 to 24 hours a day with nothing to do during that time, since Attica had no newspapers and very few books, none of which were in Spanish despite having numerous non-English speaking prisoners. Now, in theory, prisoners could request to have something sent to them from the outside, but such items had to pass through inspection. Much of this reading material, though, would be deemed to be inappropriate for one reason or another, and subsequently withheld from the prisoners. It wasn't just publications either, as the mail in general was subject to censorship, with Black and Puerto Rican prisoners being the most likely to have their mail censored and withheld. Indeed, while prisoners could have any newspaper or periodical sent to them, Black newspapers and various religious publications, especially ones written for Muslims, were deemed inappropriate and thus banned from the prison. Additionally, anything not written in English was thrown out regardless of what it was, thereby ensuring that the Spanish-speaking Puerto Rican prison population were denied anything to read. Meanwhile, there were only 3 radio stations that the inmates could choose to listen to, and they were all shut off at 11 p.m. When the prisoners weren't locked in their cells or enjoying the scant few minutes they were allowed in the yard, they were expected to work. In general, the best jobs in the prison involved being a clerk or a messenger in the administration building. Barring that, jobs in the laundry, the kitchen, and the hospital were seen as the most desirable. Those not lucky enough to land one of these jobs were typically stuck with more menial back-breaking work. Regardless of what job one had, though, few inmates earned more than 6 cents a day, although a select few could make a whole $2.90 a day. Yet even this was nowhere near enough to survive in Attica. You see, Attica's prisoners needed money to get by. For example, prisoners weren't given much in the way of clothes, and what they were given was thin and insufficient in the cold upstate New York winters. They were also only provided with a single bar of soap or a single roll of toilet paper at the start of each month that were expected to last them until the next month, a situation that essentially forced the men to limit themselves to a single sheet of toilet paper a day. Meanwhile, the prisoners were only allowed 1 shower per week and were only given 2 quarts of water a day, water that they were expected to use to shave, brush their teeth, wash their socks and underwear, and also clean their cell to the satisfaction of a guard's inspection. Then there was the food they were provided with, which was pitifully insufficient. You see, the state's budget only allotted 63 cents to feed each prisoner, which, as you might expect in practice, fell far short of the federally recommended minimum dietary standards. As a result, many an Attica prisoner went to bed hungry on a daily basis, which was the main reason why the kitchen jobs were so desirable, as despite their harder 7-day-a-week schedule, the men who worked those jobs had the opportunity to eat anything that was left over. Now, there was a system set up where the prisoners could purchase warmer clothes, more food, and other necessities, like a toothbrush, toothpaste, shampoo, deodorant, a razor, and even extra toilet paper. But again, the prisoners were paid so little, they really couldn't afford any of these things. Now, again, theoretically, the prisoners' families could also help make up this shortfall by sending money to meet these basic needs, but most of their families were too poor to do so. Plus, nearly half of the prisoners hailed from New York City, which is important to note as travel expenses from the city to upstate New York round trip potentially cost $100 between a bus ticket and cab fare, as a bus didn't actually get them all that close to the prison. Plus, there was also the fact that anyone who made this trip often had to miss a day of work to do so. The idea then that the prisoners' families wouldn't have any extra cash to give their imprisoned loved ones was completely ludicrous. This situation was especially true for the prison's many African American and Puerto Rican prisoners, as more than anything else, the thing that seemed to determine where a prisoner worked in Attica, and by extension, if they got anywhere near enough money to provide for their basic needs, was their race. You see, only 37% of Attica's population was white, yet they disproportionately held the majority of the best jobs in the prison. For example, white prisoners held 62% of the jobs in the officers' mess hall, and 67% of the clerk positions, jobs that were the highest paid and considered the easiest in the prison. In contrast, 76% of the jobs in the low-paying metal shop and 80% of the grueling physical jobs in the grading companies were filled by African Americans and Puerto Rican prisoners. In addition to the lack of food, the low pay, the racial hierarchy, and the lack of basic necessities like toilet paper, the prisoners were also burdened with the prison's numerous rules, both written and unwritten, that were applied seemingly at random, as the guards were pretty much free to enforce which rules they saw fit. As a result, certain behaviors that were ignored by certain guards would be grounds for harsh punishment from others. For example, with some guards it was fine to talk while heading to the mess hall, but if this was done in the presence of another guard, the inmates in question could find themselves confined to their cell for 24 hours a day for some indeterminate number of days, a punishment known as being keep-locked. A punishment that was not only used for random and seemingly minor infractions, but was also used as leverage to force prisoners to work their exceedingly low-paying jobs. For example, Angel Martinez, who was previously mentioned, suffered from intense pain due to his polio. This pain then caused him to not work for 2 days. As punishment for failing to perform his job, Martinez was locked in his cell 24/7 for a full month, which served as both a punishment and a warning to not miss work again. Now, since many of these violations that prisoners were punished for stem from one unwritten rule or another, which were applied at the whim of the various prison guards, you again get to see the racism that was rampant among the prison staff in action. As such, it was the non-white prisoners who were typically punished the most. Indeed, even the white prisoners in Attica would note how the guards applied the rules differently to them than their black and Puerto Rican brethren. And even when the rules were written down, they were designed to work against the non-white prisoners. For example, when it came to who could and could not visit, common law wives and the children of such relationships were not eligible, a policy that impacted African American and Puerto Rican prisoners at a higher rate, as over 20% of the inmates in each group were in such relationships. In addition to the keep block punishment, Attica also had another housing block, Z, which was commonly referred to as HPZ or the box, as this was the prison segregation area where men were held in solitary for disciplinary reasons, just as capricious as all the other forms of discipline in the prison. Yet as frustrating as all of this was, potentially even more so, was the parole system. You see, every month the parole board would come to Attica for their hearings, and each time some men would be selected for early release while others weren't. Yet no one, not a single member of the prison population, could say with any confidence what one had to do to get early parole. You either got it or you didn't, and no one could say for sure why. Yet, even for the lucky few who mysteriously were granted early parole, it wasn't like some get-out-of-jail-free card, as they were not allowed to leave until after they managed to get themselves a job on the outside, which was easier said than done, as in addition to the whole former convict thing was the fact that the only way of getting a job was using an outdated phone book, that they then had to comb through and call up random businesses, hoping that A, they still existed, B, had a job opening, and C, were willing to hire them. Adding a further level of difficulty to this situation was the fact that the prison system didn't actually offer any educational or vocational training, something that even a number of the prison guards thought was a mistake and a disservice. Speaking of disservices, let's now turn our attention to Attica's medical facilities, which only had 2 doctors, Dr. Williams and Dr. Stenberg, on staff to provide for all the numerous needs of all 2,000 inmates. Now, you would think such a situation would leave these 2 doctors overworked, but that doesn't seem to have been the case, as neither man seemed to care a whit about any of these men who were supposed to be under their care, as they didn't so much treat conditions as just ignore them. For example, in many cases, the best a prisoner who had a chronic and ongoing condition was going to get from the pair of them was an aspirin before being sent on their way. Then there was the fact that neither doctor spoke Spanish, something that did not seem to bother either man, as not once did they ask for any kind of interpreter so they might better treat the prison's many Spanish-speaking Puerto Rican prisoners. Plus, as uncaring as these men were toward the basic prisoners, they were somehow even more callous when dealing with those facing disciplinary punishment. One man, for example, who had been placed in solitary had broken bones in his hand and couldn't move his fingers anymore. Yet when he asked the doctor to treat his wounds, Dr. Stenberg literally was said to have turned his back on the man and instructed him to write to a different doctor for assistance. Dr. Williams, meanwhile, was so unresponsive to his patient's needs that in 1969 a 30-year-old prisoner actually died while under his care. It was at this point that some of the civilians working in the prison actually felt compelled to hold a meeting to discuss ways of holding the doctor responsible for his actions, or inactions as the case may be. Yet, ultimately, nothing was ever done, and neither doctor ever showed any inclination to change their ways. Meanwhile, as seemingly impossible as it was for the Attica prisoners to get any actual medical care, they were regularly the subject of medical experiments. For example, a number of prisoners, in exchange for receiving money that they so desperately needed for any number of basic necessities, agreed to be exposed to a virus to test their immune response. Now, to be fair, all the prisoners involved did sign off on the informed consent forms they were presented with. However, even the doctor responsible for these tests had to admit later that he doubted how truly informed the inmates had been about what was being done to them. Now, to be clear, none of these issues were secret. Indeed, a number of correctional officers in Attica and elsewhere would note that if the state just provided them with just a bit more money in the budget to simply provide the prisoners with enough food to eat, a lot of their disciplinary problems would vanish. Of course, though, those most aware of these issues were none other than the prisoners themselves. As a result, they talked openly and frequently with one another about how to reform the prison. For those involved in these discussions, the heart of the issue was the need for the prisoners to be treated as human beings who were serving time, instead of being treated as some kind of unreasonable monsters who should just be abused and ignored. The fact that these discussions were taking place and the way they were being framed was partially the result of one reform that had actually been implemented in the 60s, which was having some actual educational programs in the prison. So instead of just leaving the prisoners in there to rot with no ability to improve themselves, and by extension their chances of living a normal life once they got out, the state had begun offering courses to the inmates, a number of whom readily started attending these classes in the hopes of improving both their and their families' lot in life. Among the most popular courses for the Attica prisoners were those on sociology. In one such class, for example, the inmates would read the works of Adam Smith, Marx, and Mao, which they then discussed at length, and how their own life experiences were reflected in these texts. Increasingly then, the inmates found themselves speaking about marginalized people and how they might empower themselves. Now, all of these issues already existed in the late 60s, when things started getting even worse, when more and more prisoners were packed into Attica's walls. Not helping matters was the fact that instead of hiring more guards, prison administrators kept their ranks as is, and just increased the number of prisoners each officer was responsible for. Basically, like a school, instead of hiring more teachers, just increasing the number of students in each class. Soon, in response to the rapidly expanding prison population, each CO was expected to escort 2 to 3 companies of prisoners, each one consisting of 40 to 45 men, to places like the mess hall and the yards all by themselves, a situation that understandably made the guards nervous. Yet still the prisons kept functioning as a result of the majority of the prisoners just wanting to keep their heads down and do as they were told. That being said, in the late 60s into the early 70s, an increasing number of the prisoners who found themselves in Attica were young color kids who were politically aware, having been inspired by the civil rights movement and various radicals like the Black Panthers, Malcolm X, and even Che Guevara. These prisoners then were less likely to accept things just because that was the way things were. As a result, they were much more likely to stand up to what they saw as injustice and oppression for both their own sakes and those of their fellow prisoners. In the eyes of the guards and the prison administrators, though, such prisoners were troublemakers who, when they acted out, had to be punished even more severely. So, Attica's guards became even harsher and even more petty with their rule enforcement. They also started relying more and more on intimidation and verbal abuse to try and keep the prisoners in line. Tactics which, you might have guessed, only made these more politically aware and militant prisoners that much more likely to stand up against such abuses. Of course, this became a vicious cycle, as when these young prisoners reacted to the increasingly violent tactics of the guards responded by becoming even more violent, which again led to a response from the prisoners, to which the guards again responded with more violence and intimidation, and on it went. A situation that was only exacerbated by the fact that the white guards had little to no knowledge, contact, or experience with black and brown people outside of the prison. The guards you see typically hailed from the numerous small towns across western New York that were overwhelmingly white and Catholic. As a result, these guards had not grown up with anyone like the African American and Puerto Rican prisoners that they were now expected to deal with on a daily basis. Plus, it wasn't like these guards had a chance to encounter the more diverse world outside of their small